frightened by the need to hold something so small like an illicit coin. The market smelled of fish, rope, the iron tang of money. Men's voices curved around the stalls with the calm of routine. Faye had brushed past him just before, a tray of smoked sprat balanced on her hip. Their passing had been unremarkable. She had an apprenticeship to tend, he had ledgers to worry over. Yet there had been a look swift, nearly ashamed, that carried more than curiosity. He did not ask questions at the stall. He folded the scrap and put it into the pocket of his coat. Later, when the town thickened into evening, and he shut the door of his small room and hung his coat against the peg, he laid the paper on his table like a talisman. The lamp threw a half-circle of light across the threadbare notebook he used to keep his own careful records, and the scrap looked like a piece of ragged sail, ready to be read into a storm. Jonah had known the shapes of secrets for a long time, how they sat lighter in one hand than another, how the weight of them changed with the telling. His own ledger had always been a kind of geography for him, a map of what people had traded and what had been left behind. It was in the ledger that he had first learned to see the difference between sorrow that could be eased and sorrow that was structural, the kind that held a person together. He had always written with caution, deliberate words spaced like stitches. But the fragments he now held were not his. They were not stitched by his careful rules. They were catalogued in someone else's language, neat and cold and almost pleased with its own order. He lay the scrap next to his notebook and began to think of Gideon. Gideon Pry had the look of someone who could not quite persuade his face to relax into ordinary expression. He worked for Elias Venn in the close quarters of the ledger room that everyone who used the trade knew of. The place where jars were labeled and stacked and where decisions were made in the small, precise language of bureaucracy. Jonah had met Gideon a few times when business brought Elias to the surface, Gideon with a neat stack of tags, Elias with his thin, decisive gestures. To Jonah's surprise, Gideon's fingers had once trembled when he passed a coin. It was a detail Jonah had noted, not because he liked the man but because he thought it might mean something. That evening, after the rain had shaved the day thin and the lamps along the quay softened into a low, watchful glow, Gideon came to him. He did so without fanfare, a shadow at Jonah's doorway, a hand on the lintel, a face that was more tired than alarmed. "You wanted to see me," Gideon said. His voice was neither low nor secretive, it was simply careful. Jonah had not expected him to come at all. He had imagined slipping through alleys or overhearing things in the market. The concrete arrival of the man felt like the sudden application of an instruction to a machine. Jonah stepped aside and offered the bench in his narrow room. Gideon sat as if he had practiced the action and failed to make it appear relaxed. He was clutching a thin envelope with both hands, as if the contents were too fragile to be trusted to his fingers. They drank the thin tea Jonah boiled, and Gideon's eyes kept going to the ledger on Jonah's table, Jonah's old habit of placing his work in the middle of any room, as if its presence reassured him that the world could be arranged. He placed the envelope on the table, slid it forward, and then took it back as if testing the decision. "I don't want trouble, lad," Gideon said. "That's the first thing. But I'm tired of seeing things and not well. You know how it is. We count columns, and the counting feels like it's keeping us alive. But sometimes the counting feels like burying a thing alive." Jonah had not known the man would speak in that way. The sentence came out of Gideon almost apologetically, the words clumsy with the effort of being ordinary. Jonah kept his face still. He had been an observer of men like Gideon all his life, people who made a living from making things look neat. There was a softness in Gideon's voice that made Jonah think of a ledger's margins where people sometimes drew little, useless flourishes. He opened the envelope. Inside were slips of paper, smaller than the scrap Faye had given him, the edges ragged as if they had been torn rather than cut. Each slip bore a single clear label, written in a careful hand. Row 2, jar 7, the boy's first sentence. Row 5, jar 2, the mother's kiss, 1896. Row 3, jar 14, the laugh of a daughter. There were numbers and neat abbreviations, and beneath some of them were annotated notes, short and almost clinical. Fragile, do not trade without 2 witnesses. High identity index. Requires consent form C. The last line of one slip had a word Jonna did not expect, anchor. He read it twice. The lamp made the ink proud and dark. The room outside the circle of light grew very still, as if the whole town were holding its breath for the sentence to end. Anchor, Gideon said, watching him. He uses that word. Elias. He thinks some of them hold people together. He thinks perhaps, if we keep them tidy we can keep people from tipping. Jonna's first feeling was not outrage or anger. For a second he felt the small, private sensation that comes when a person is being examined in an honest light, the accurate chill of being seen. Then a slow, methodical sadness settled over him. It was not melodramatic. It was a knowledge that his practical craft had borders he had not been attending to. He had wanted to make people lighter where he could. He had not wanted to become part of a system that unmade men. He set the slips down, lining them out on the table, as if they were delicate fish to be inspected. The words upon them read like a registry of intimacies. The boy's first sentence. It was not merely a regret or an awkward memory. It was a first utterance that tethered a man to who he had once been, perhaps the single phrase that shaped a life, or gave it an orientation. The mother's kiss had a year attached to it, and Jonna knew the kind of specificity that suggested the shadow was not a general sense of grief, but a moment that had sat like a hinge in a household. Each label was a place where memory and personhood met. Gideon watched Jonna the way one watches someone trying to repair a delicate instrument. I took these out, lad. Not all of them, just enough to make me sleepless. I thought if I could show them to someone who might understand the shape, why bring them to me? Jonna asked. The question came out small and a little sharp. He had always thought of his ledger as a moral map that he alone had to hold carefully. To have someone else break its borders felt like an intrusion. Gideon's face tightened. Because you're the one who takes things and does something. You hear people. You decide whether a regret can be eased. You had better know what is being taken without your seeing. And because he paused, as though for breath. Because Elias doesn't always tell people what's being done. He thinks he knows what's best. But some of these are anchors. He calls them that. Jonna folded his hands over the slips. For a long time they were simply paper beneath his palms, nothing more. Then he began to see how the economy had been working in a way he had not allowed himself to name. He had thought of his trades in terms of lightness and relief. He had thought of Eliases as buyers of the odd and the rare. He had not imagined a systematic removal of what made a person the person they were. He had not imagined a ledger that could change the shape of the town by altering, with clinical strokes, what tomorrow might recall. In the days that followed, Jonna read the slips as if they were instruction manuals for a grief he had only half known. He kept some at the bottom of his chest like a secret charm and carried others to old Tilda's. Tilda handled them as she handled anything that held the town's small truths, with a kind of ritual patience. Her shop smelled of dried herbs and metal. There were jars on shelves like quiet witnesses. She turned each slip over in her hands, her eyes placid and careful. I told you, she said to him once, when the slips were out and the lamp made her face soft and pitted. She said it without anger and without triumph, only wariness. I told you that some things are not to be tidied. I refused once, long ago, and it has been with me like a stone ever since. Jonna wanted to ask what she had refused to trade, but her reluctance to name the thing gave it a weight that made him keep silent. Tilda's history had always been a kind of moral architecture for him, a way of thinking about how small acts compound into a life. Her refusal had been simple and stubborn. She had kept a shadow and been required thereafter to live with what it meant. Her choice had not made her freer. Faye's motive for the scrap was more complicated. When he found her again on an afternoon when gulls fought the wind and the horizon was a slow, uncertain line, she shoved her hands into the pockets of her apron and did not look at him directly. I shouldn't have given it to you, she said. But Gideon looked at me wrong after the meeting, and I thought. She hesitated, as if the thought had embarrassed her. You listen, lad. You listen and you try to do the right thing. You might be able to make some kind of order from it that isn't just catalog. Jonah appreciated the bluntness and also the shyness of her confession. She had been working for Elias long enough to see the wheels of the operation. She had taken to cataloging the jars at times, and in doing so had found herself noting particulars. She told him, without theatricality, of the jars labeled with tiny details, the ones that always made her uneasy, the soldier's last promise, the woman's first laugh after the fever, the son's name she could not speak. She said it as if listing the jars had the same ordinariness as listing the day's shipments. Do you think they're dangerous? Jonah asked. She shrugged. Sometimes. Sometimes they put things back like healing. Sometimes her hands made a small gesture that suggested something slipped into a gap and could not be put back the same way. Sometimes once it's gone, the place it made is empty. Jonah had been thinking about that emptiness ever since he first touched the slips. He had seen in other people's faces the subtle smoothing of corners where something had been removed. A sailor who could not remember a child's laugh might keep the child's hand steady on a rope, and yet have a strange tilt in his eye. A widow who no longer woke with a certain ache slept, certainly. But there was a neatness to her day that sometimes collapsed into loneliness. Jonah had argued to himself that easing a pain could be an act of mercy, that the quiet repair of household life mattered. But the slips named particular things. They made clear that some removals were not merely smoothing but surgical, excising the part of a person that had held an orientation toward the world. There were nights when Jonah could not sleep, and he would take the slips out and imagine the jars as people. He tried to give them faces, a man who had lost his first sentence, and hence all the ways he had learned to speak to other men. A woman who had lost a kiss, and thus the memory that taught her how to press her child's forehead with tenderness. These are not entirely literal images. They were his way of making the knowledge inhabitable. The more he read, the more he felt a throat-clenching pity that was not theatrical but precise, a thing that made his hands ache. At the same time, he could not pretend the discovery simplified his choices. There were many examples, in the town, where the removal of a small sharp memory had allowed a family to stay together. Jonah had made trades that had stitched 2 or 3 lives back into a useful form. The moral arithmetic was not additive. It was a lattice with unexpected cross supports. He found himself thinking about the woman who, after Jonah had traded a small grief, went back to her loom and performed the pattern she had abandoned for years. He had witnessed the practical good of his work and could not easily renounce it. The slips did not offer only condemnation. They offered, in Gideon's shaky way, evidence that a different measure had been in effect elsewhere. Gideon's confession came with another small admission. He had not simply taken slips and given them to Jonah out of conscience. He had been careless in his own watching, and the ledger had been altered, some entries removed, some jars relabeled. Jonah felt the precise cruelty of that. Not only were things catalogued elsewhere, but even the record keepers had been tampered with. Gideon, whom Jonah had always considered a man of tidy habits, had been reduced by disquiet into a smuggler of fragments. "I thought if you saw them you'd know where they come from," Gideon said. "I thought if you saw the words you'd understand perhaps. Elias thinks he's protecting the town by giving us order. Sometimes I think it's a way to make forgetting look like care." Jonah had no ready reply. His hands were empty, and yet he felt as if they held a ledger the size of the town. There was a particularness to this revival of knowledge. Once you had seen a jar's label, you could not blithely return to business as usual. That knowledge made everything smaller and more intimate and harder to touch. In the week that followed, more slips reached him. Some arrived wrapped in rag paper, left behind a pile of salted cod, hidden beneath a rope coil, or pushed beneath the loose board of the quay where no one thought to look. Jonah learned the shapes of furtive giving, the scratches of someone's boot in the mud, the discreet coughing when someone passed by, the look of a child's hand reaching and then withdrawing. The gifts were small, frightened. They were the ways people tried to make amends to their own consciences. He began to make quiet inquiries. He returned to houses he had visited before, looked at faces more closely. There was a man in the shipwright's yard whose laugh had been straightened by a trade some years earlier. Jonah watched him speak and noticed an odd absence in the way his hands moved when he recalled something that should have been there. There was a woman who now kept her son's room, as if it were a shrine to a thing she could no longer feel. Jonah saw the town's architecture bent by these small removals, habits altered, stories shortened, an economy that smoothed the rough edges until they sometimes lost their use as handles one could hang oneself by. When he took the slips to old Tilda, her reaction was not dramatic. She handled them as if they were bones that needed to be washed and set. She said once, very quietly, that there are some memories that are like scaffolding. Remove them and the house stays up for a while, but the strain is born elsewhere. You can fix a door for a season, she told him, but if you take the beam out that holds the floor, something else will give. Jonah found himself holding that image with him, a beam invisible to most until someone slipped a hand beneath the floor and felt its absence. His work had always been a trade in little repairs. He had never imagined he might be part of a project that took beams. On a damp evening when the fog pressed close to the quay and the sound of boots was softened into a slow percussion, Jonah met Faye in the narrow passage behind the tannery. She was nervous in an ordinary way, fingers fumbling with a scrap of cloth. "There are more, lad," she said. "Labels, old ones Elias doesn't mention in public. Be careful. Gideon will be watched now." Jonah's mouth was dry. He had not wanted to be watched. He had wanted, theoretically, to keep the ledger as a private instrument of repair. The truth of the slips forced him into an impossible position. To do nothing risked collusion. To act might unhinge people who had grown around their absent things. He thought of Mara bringing him bread, of Captain Liz whose eyes had narrowed in disapproval when Jonah's trades had endangered a cargo run, of the faces he had helped smooth. He thought of the sailor who had stopped waking at night, but who could no longer hum a tune that used to guide his hands. In the ledger fragments, each of those trade-offs had a label and a shelf number. The town had been made tidy in private, and the tidy place had different edges than the town had before. That night he sat up and wrote. He wrote in his ledger, but this time his entries were not the neat trades he had always recorded as if they were small, bound acts of charity. These records were questions. He noted dates and names and the places where jars might be kept. He listed who had been helped and who, perhaps, had been opened. He wrote slowly, the lamp at his elbow making the page a narrow river of light. When he closed the book it was late and his hands trembled. He tasted the salt of the harbor on his tongue, and a cold sort of loneliness was there that was not only for himself, but for the town that had been rearranged, piece by measured piece. The slips had not told him who was right. They had given him a fact, a catalogue of a certain kind of removal. What to do with that fact remained knotty and personal and unbearably proximate. He fell asleep with the slips under his pillow and woke to the silver of a lamp in the morning, feeling as if the paper had warmed to his breath. There was a small, indecipherable courage in having the knowledge. It made him responsible whether he wished to be or not. He found that his hands moved with a new urgency that day, repairing a door latch, helping Mara coil a rope, listening longer when someone told him a story. The world seemed at once smaller and more sharp-edged, as if an invisible hand had drawn lines around what could be safely altered and what could not. In the end, the ledger fragments did what Gideon had hoped and what Faye had feared. They made it impossible for Jonah to remain merely a local fixer who smoothed edges for a living. The slips reoriented his work into a moral problem. He could not unsee the labels that named lives. He could not unlearn the word anchor, which had lodged itself in his head with the sharpness of a splinter. He folded the slips and put them back into Gideon's envelope, but the act was symbolic rather than a closing. The knowledge lived in him now, a dim H that did not promise an answer. That night, As he walked the quay, he felt the town pass him by, its lamps pulling little circles in the fog. He looked at faces he had seen 1,000 times and felt the new, small terror that the person one sees may not be complete in the way one imagines. He thought of the ledger, of jars on distant shelves, of labels that read like epitaphs. At the very edge of the quay, where the boards were worn and the sea smelled like old coins, he paused and rested his palms on the rail. The tide moved in the steady way he had known since childhood. It did not seem to care for the human business of cataloging and tuddying. Yet the tide had always been witness to human things, and now it sounded like a patient examiner. Jonah wondered, not for the first time, what it would mean for the town if the jars were pried open and the memories put back. Who among them would be made whole, and who would be destroyed by the return of what they had learned to live without? He did not know. He only knew the immediate insistence of the slips in his pocket, and the ache behind his ribs that had become a question of obligation. He had always thought his work light and discreet. He had thought he could do good without altering the town's architecture. The slips made him realize that sometimes repair is a kind of construction, and that taking a beam out of a house is not the same as replacing a broken hinge. The night closed like a book. Jonah walked home with his hands in his pockets and the envelope warm against his thigh. He felt, with an unsteady clarity, that something inevitable was approaching. The knowledge he had been given would make a choice of him, whether he wished to choose or remain a man who kept the ledger closed and the town's changes invisible. He put his hand to the envelope and felt the teeth of the paper, which was not at all comforting. He did not yet know how he would answer. But he had the ledger fragments and in them a call that could not be returned. Outside his window, a lamp guttered and was steadied by the hand of some anonymous passerby. The light made a small circle on the wet cobbles, and, for an instant, Jonah thought of the shapes on the slips as if they were stars catalogued in a book that could tell how people were held in place. Then the lamp steadied and the town breathed on, indifferent and intimate all at once. The moral arithmetic lay waiting, patient as a tide. Jonah had never thought of his own shadow as anything other than a working instrument. It was a certainty as small and habitual as the damp at the hem of his trousers. He rose with the tide and the light, and the same reflex to lift a jar from his satchel when someone hesitated at the quay. He had learned, in the early days, to read the way regret sat in a shadow, the way one might read the grain in a plank, a knot of anger, a run of shame. A long, thin band of absence where a person carried a memory like a loose pebble. He recorded these shapes in the ledger as if the marks themselves were a map of service. None of it had prepared him for the absence of his own shade, a small, clinical nothingness at the edge of a lamp's pool, as if some careful hand had smoothed the dark away. It was late. He had been awake for longer than any ordinary hour, though it was not wakefulness in the sense one reserves for crisis, no racing heart, no fevered searching. The room in which he slept was small, a single pane of glass that faced the quay and a shelf of jars. A lamp burned on his table. Its light fell hard and honest, turning the wet cobbles of the street outside into a shallow sheet of gold. He kneeled to light another wick and watched, automatically, for the shadow his feet should make. Nothing. Where shade should have pooled beneath him, there was only a bright edge, and then the cobbles, pale reflection. He straightened slowly, the way one does when an object in a familiar place is not there and one cannot at first name the loss. It was not a sudden, theatrical absence. It presented rather like a measurement. He put his hand to the floor as if he might feel cold where darkness ought to be. The wood was the same, worn smooth by boots and damp. The only change was a small, steady hole in the town's pattern, the place in the pattern where his shadow usually interlocked. He lit the lamp more carefully, watching for any stray line of dark. There was none. He moved to the window and crouched, head pressed near the glass, to see whether the pair of boots left a form on the wet street. The quay reflected the lamp like a blot of pale fat. The cart boys' voices drifted faintly, and were cut by the clank of a chain. Across the street a woman passed hurriedly, her shawl tight about her shoulders. Her own shadow followed her in the expected way, long and thin and trailing like soap. Jonah's boots moved on the sill, but the side of the window took no black. The thing was small and domestic, which made it worse. He did not know how long he stood like that. He had always read shadows as if they were not mere by-products of light but sentences. To have one sentence taken felt like having a name rubbed off a doorframe. There were practical responses that came first. He checked the satchel where he kept his jars and strings, where he sometimes kept a spare lamp and a little packet of salt. Nothing was out of place except a faint, clean smell in the satchel paper and dust, and something that might have been a long closed room. The ledger lay under a folded scrap of cloth on the table. When he opened it, his thumb followed the familiar handwriting, the tidy columns of names and dates and shorthand about the curvature of regret. Home smoothing lighter sleep 2 coppers, Reed softened found kindness 1 evening's watch. These were the small, quiet transactions that had kept him fed and felt, in a muted way, like belonging. He ran his thumb along a page near the back, where the ink had already bled slightly from damp. There, almost at the edge, was a line he did not remember having written. He had imagined his ledger as a map he could trust. The presence of any unfamiliar mark felt like a betrayal. The line had been scrubbed, nearly clean paper raised as if something had been scraped away. There was a faint crescent of residue where letters had been. He held the ledger up to the lamplight and could not read what had been there. His stomach tightened. The ledger had been more than a tool. It had been a kind of conscience. The idea of someone else moving things in it felt like someone moving the boundaries of his small moral world. He thought at once of Elias Venn and the neat, catalogued way of talking that had seemed at first like a curiosity and now, in the soft hours of the night, looked like a threat. Elias kept ledgers of his own, Gideon Pry kept records for him, and Faye, the young woman with ink-stained fingers, had been seen hauling small, old jars into the back of Elias' shop. Jonah tried to push away the pattern of suspicion. In practice his mind always worked by matching shape to shape. Missing ink in his own ledger fit the missing shadow like 2 halves of the same tear. Still, this was imagination. He let himself make a second, more methodical list: check rooms, call old Tilda, speak with Mara in the morning, revisit the last few trades, comb the alleys. He wrote slowly the first note he could make: shadow gone, check ledger, Tilda. Then he folded the page closed and seated himself at the table with the ledger weighted by the palm of his hand. With the ledger open, there was a temptation to read every entry as a possible theft. Each name might be a place from which something had been taken or where trace of a taken thing had been left. His vision of the town as a place of careful repairs changed. The trades he had thought of as mercies now presented to him as scars. He went outside as if he were following the ledger's margins. The fog sat in a low, thick bank like a blanket thrown across the quay. It muffled sound and softened edges until the town looked as if someone had brushed it with quick strokes of unsteady gray. Jonah walked the route he took on errands past the fish stalls where nets hung like sleeping beasts. By Captain Liss' office with its brass bolt that looked as if it had never been polished for show, towards the rope bridge where Mara worked. He kept his hands in his pockets and moved without purpose, testing the surfaces of his own absence. People's faces appeared and dissolved in the fog with the small details Jonah knew to watch. A woman standing at the hatch of a stall laughed, without turning to take a coin from her neighbor. Her laughter sounded ordinary until Jonah saw how her hand stayed empty, how reflex memory had been pared back. A boy he had helped months before gave him a shadow that smoothed a particular shame, passed with his father, and did not glance toward the sea the way boys with longing do. Jonah felt each sight like a paper cut. He had thought it a mercy to smooth someone's edge, but to see the edge gone where it had held a particular identifying angle made him feel as though he had taken a shape that people needed. He wished, in that small way that is the first sign of culpability, that he had kept more of the grain. At the rope bridge, Mara recognized him before he spoke. She was tying new knots, her wrists